So in our previous video, we decided to build the best budget PC that you can buy right now. We combined secondhand and used parts. And then a few days later, I discovered that I could buy a Z370 motherboard for 50% less than what I bought that MSI B365M for. And I bought that motherboard new and this one secondhand. And I saved about 400 Rand, which is about $20. So that's quite a significant saving. And I'm getting a significant upgrade as well. If I look at this board here, it opens up a couple of things for us. Like we have 3 PCIe express lanes, which means we can potentially have SLI or Crossfire support. So this motherboard is feature rich. It's got all of these onboard display options. It also has the USB Type-C and all the other stuff that the B365M had, but it has more SATA ports. So it's got about 8 SATA ports. It's got 2 M.2 or NVMe slots, which is absolutely fantastic. It has the USB headers as well, 2 of them, fantastic. Also 4 RAM slots, and yeah, overall this is just a much better board. Obviously the Z370 is also made for overclocking, so that's fantastic. You can potentially upgrade your i3 at a later stage and see a significant increase in performance. So this board is absolutely amazing, especially that SLI support. So obviously in our previous build we went with the 1070, but I also found this card, which is also a GTX 1070. It's a little bit faulty though, so I bought this for next to nothing. It was about $10 or 200 Rand, so really cheap. This doesn't have any cooling with it though, and the display doesn't work at all. So it was used for mining before, but I got it for a steal, and it can still mine. But obviously I want to test and see what would happen if I try to SLI this card. Will it still work? We don't need to let it work, or we don't need the display to work. So that's fine. And I slapped on a 12mm fan on here. This is the normal, the normal 3-pin fan header, so we can just plug that in, and be sure to plug that in because we're going to need that to cool this graphics card in the bottom slot. It has a massive heatsink on it, so I'm not too worried about cooling on this thing. The TDP is also quite low. I think it's about 140 watt or 150 watt. So we're going to SLI these 2 cards and potentially crossfire some AMD cards. First things first though, we would obviously need to disassemble our previous build. Easiest way to do that is to just pop the memory out, and then we're going to remove the CPU as well, which is also quite straightforward. Remember to be quite careful when doing this and to unplug the CPU from the power, the fan, and then obviously when you close the little lever here, just be careful, and then obviously replace that plastic black cover as well. You would need to keep it for an RMA if anything goes wrong with the board at a later stage. So it's a very good idea to keep that, and don't throw it away. It's also nice to resell it when you have that little cover on. So obviously we just pop up the lever to reveal the pins. We then insert the CPU by lining it up, straightforward to do. And then I take the cover off before I put the lever on. Some guys just put the lever on and make the cover pop off by itself, but yeah, whichever way, doesn't really matter. Obviously install the CPU cooler, make sure that it's secure so that it makes good contact with the CPU. And then I've went ahead and just installed the memory. So I'm going to try and do a dual channel memory for this motherboard. The previous one didn't work in dual channel, but I'm feeling quite good about this board. I think we will get away with running dual channel on different brands and different speeds of memory. And then yeah, next up is the graphics card. So you want to install the primary card in the slot that it's closest to the CPU, which is generally the top one, right at the top where it can fit in. So that's quite straightforward. What I really like about this board, there's enough space to breathe for the second card. But right now we just want to see if the system is actually going to boot up, so we're just going to connect all the cables on our test bench or our test box and then see if it will turn on. So this board has LEDs that turns on before it powers up, so that's good. It's a good indicator to show that there is power to the board before we try and switch it on. So switching it on obviously shows it boots up. We already have a SSD with Windows on it, so we're good to go. The setup seems to be working. Before we carry on though, we just want to check some basic settings in the motherboard. So we boot it into the BIOS just to check that the CPU is detecting correctly, which it is. Base clock of 3.6. We've got 16 gig memory, which is 2 8 gigs running at 2133, one Crucial, one Kingston, which is fine. So all that's left to do now is just to build this into a case. Because we're going to running multiple GPUs, we need some anchoring. So case is a good idea. Some of you might disagree with me, but I like to attach, or rather plug in, the front IOs, like the reset and the power button and all of that, before I put the motherboard and screw it in. It just makes it so much easier to access. So I do that first before I lower in the motherboard to get connected in. So we're just going to speed up here just a little bit till we get to our next step, which is to secure the motherboard. And while you're at that, make sure that your IO shield is installed at the back. The last thing you want is to look at the back of your case and see that you forgot your IO shield. So I only use 4 to 6 screws max. You're welcome to screw everything in, but I find that 4 to 6 screws on the motherboard seems to be sufficient. Then we're going to speed up a little bit again, and the next step would be to install our graphics card. So obviously, like before, we installed it on the top slot. That's the fastest slot, so your display card for SLI or Crossfire should always be in the top slot if you're going to do that. So we'll install this one first before we install the second card a little bit later. Good time to do some cable management as well. Make sure you've got all the SATA cables connected for the hard drives, and now we can go ahead and insert that second card before we attach the PCI Express power, the 8-pin. Both of these cards takes 8-pin. We're lucky enough our power supply has enough for both, and there we go, all built and ready to be tested. It's all working, there's enough clearance, there's enough airflow. Very good to do that. But before we do that, we talked about Crossfire. So I wanted to test out Crossfire first, because for one GTX 1070 you can probably get 2 RX 570s. And what's nice about the Crossfire setup is it does not require an SLI bridge. It is software based, so we don't need to get any extra hardware. We literally just need 2 cards and a motherboard that support Crossfire. And funny enough, Crossfire is supported a lot more on motherboards than SLI is supported. So let's see how a Crossfire RX 570 versus a 1070 single goes. First test, we decided to go for the straightforward 3D Mark Basic. So we can see here that the RX 570 Crossfire setup is pulling ahead slightly. Not much, but slightly. And just remember that these are cost-wise the same, or even a little bit cheaper to go for the AMD Crossfire setup. And in a generic benchmark like this, you should see 100% scaling, which means that you'll get double the performance if you double up on cards. So you can expect half of the performance on one RX 570, and these are the 4 gig models as well. Now for some real life gaming, we went for Tomb Raider. This game does support multiple GPUs in game. We can see here that the Crossfire setup is actually pulling ahead of the single 1070 with 100% GPU utilization on both cards, which is hectic. It's pulling all of these RX, or both of these RX 570s to their knees in this test. The 1070 is still a little bit ahead, but as we can see, it's funny enough, for some reason there is CPU headroom in this for the Crossfire setup. It's slightly behind CPU usage versus the 1070. Another game that we did was the Assassin's Creed Odyssey game. Now, this game does not support multiple GPUs, but for some reason, the performance difference between these were not that significant. I'm not 100% sure if this is because of a CPU bottleneck, maybe, which means that the CPU is basically not keeping up with the frames and the GPU is basically lagging behind. But I don't think so, because the GPU is sitting at 100%, so I'm not sure what happened here. This could be a fault in our testing, in drivers, in something went wrong. We'd run it multiple times with drivers reinstalled, uninstalled, and we have exactly the same performance measures. So yeah, not sure what happened there, but it doesn't look too impressive. And then in another game, which is the World War Z benchmark, we can see here this also does not support multiple GPUs. So with both of these setups running the Vulkan API, the single GTX 1070 is a little bit ahead of a single RX 570. Not by a lot, but it is a little bit better. I would say about 20 to 30% better in this specific game. We also see that the AMD, again, card uses less CPU. So this seems to be an AMD thing. It lessens the CPU load for some reason. I can't tell you why. Now, GTA 5 was a slightly different story. We saw random issues with our benchmarks with the Crossfire setup. Although the game does support multiple GPUs, there were some really strange issues happening. I don't think it's worth the performance benefit from it. It's actually not even pulling ahead of the 1070. You get weird flickering, the game loads longer. It's just a mess. I would not recommend that for that. In one game where you would expect a Crossfire setup to really show its potential is in Crisis. But funny enough, the Crisis benchmark was just tanking. We see low CPU usage, we see high GPU usage on both of these 570s, and they're struggling. A single 1070 is about 200% better. So yeah, don't know what happened there, but yeah, Crossfire for Crisis is an absolute disaster, even though it supports it. But looks wise, you have to say that the Crossfire setup looks absolutely amazing. It's just because these gaming X cards look fantastic. I mean, if you compare it to our 1070 setup, yeah, there's no competition in the looks department. Then again, we could go with better looking 1070s if that's what you're into, and maybe get a proper high bandwidth bridge before you go out and buy a high bandwidth bridge. We did some testing, and in most cases, well, actually in all our cases that we tested, benchmarks, anything you can think of, these little ribbon cables worked perfectly fine. There was no reason to spend almost 2,000 Rand, which is what, about $60 to $70 in a high bandwidth bridge. It made absolute no difference whatsoever. Multiple GPUs also have random errors, so complete pain to set up. But eventually we managed to get our SLI configuration working, and it's now time to try and benchmark some games with the setup. I decided to stick to games that actually support multiple GPUs. So first off is a GTA 5, and we do see a upgrade of about 30 to 40% in frame rates, but we also see a slowdown in loading times. As you can see, the SLI setup was lagging behind in actually loading up scenes in the game and in the benchmark, so there seems to be something not optimized there. Then obviously Crisis, which we had to run again, we see that it does support multiple GPUs on SLI configurations. The GPUs are not running at 100%, so it's not utilizing the GPUs or the CPU 100%, which is a little bit disappointing. I would have seen pushing it to the edge, but it didn't do that. We did see a upgrade in frames, but again, only 10 to 20% upgrade, so quite diminishing returns for a multiple GPU setup. Then secondly, thirdly rather, we ran Tomb Raider, which here we saw a nice bump in frame rates. Now this is a good example because on a single 1070 we were running below 60 frames a second on 1080p, but by adding a second card we were constantly hitting over 60 frames a second. So if you're quite sensitive to 60 frames and under, then this would make so much sense, because you will never dip under the 60 frames mark, which is awesome. It's silky smooth and it actually makes sense in that setup. So when it's all said and done, this was an absolute nightmare to set up software wise, something that should have been straightforward, took forever. We saw diminishing returns in basically any game, especially in the games that don't support multiple GPUs. So this was a complete colossal waste. Crossfire and SLI is not recommended. It never has been recommended, and it's not recommended right now. This was cheap though, so there is that. Thanks for watching, guys. If you like this video, please click that button. If you've not subscribed yet, please subscribe now and hit that notification bell so that you can be notified of any of our future videos. See you next time.